Finance capital and the financial oligarchy as a result of the banks becoming joint owners of industrial, commercial, and transport enterprises and acquiring their shares and bonds, and of industrial monopolies in their turn possessing shares in the banks connected with them. An interweaving of monopoly banking and industrial capital takes place, and a new kind of capital arises: finance capital. Finance capital is the capital of banking and industrial monopolies which has become knit together into one. The epoch of imperialism is the epoch of finance capital. Defining finance capital, Lenin emphasized three factors of primary importance: the concentration of production, the monopolies arising therefrom, the merging or coalescence of the banks with industry. Such is the history of the rise of finance capital, and such is the content of this term. Lenin, Imperialism, Selected Works, 1950, English edition, Vol I, Point 2, p. 478. The coalescence of bank capital with industrial capital is strikingly expressed in the personal union of the heads of the banking and industrial monopolies. The same persons head the largest monopoly associations in banking, industry, commerce, and the other branches of capitalist economy. In Germany before the First World War, the six biggest Berlin banks had their representatives serving as directors of 344 industrial enterprises and as members of 407 more. 751 companies in all. On the other hand, 51 of the biggest industrialists were members of the governing bodies of these six banks. Later on, this personal union developed still further. In 1932, there were 70 of the biggest industrialists on the governing bodies of the three principal Berlin banks. In the USA in 1950, a narrow group made up of 400 industrialists and bankers occupied 1/3 of the 3,705 of the directors' posts in 250 of the largest corporations, joint stock companies, possessing 42% of all the capital in the country. In every capitalist country, a small handful of the biggest bankers and industrial monopolists hold in their grasp all the vitally important branches of the economy and dispose of the overwhelming bulk of social wealth. Management by capitalist monopolies inevitably becomes the rule of a finance oligarchy. The Greek word oligarchy means literally the rule of a few. Imperialism is marked by the omnipotence of the monopoly trusts and syndicates, the banks and the finance oligarchy in the developed capitalist countries. The domination of the finance oligarchy is effected in the economic sphere above all by means of the so-called holding system. This means that a big financier or group of financiers controls the principal joint stock company, the parent company, which heads the concern. This company in its turn, through owning the controlling interests in them, dominates the daughter companies which depend on it, granddaughter companies are similarly situated, and so on. By means of this system, the financial bosses are able to control vast sums of the capital of others. By means of a widely ramified system of holdings, the 8 biggest financial groups in the USA, Morgan, Rockefeller, Kuhn-Loeb, Mellon, DuPont, and the Chicago, Cleveland, and Boston groups occupy the dominant position in that country's whole economy. The Morgan Group's sphere of influence in 1948 embraced banks and corporations with a total capital of $55 million. The Rockefeller Group controlled $26.7 million, the DuPont Group $6.5 million, and the Mellon Group $6 million. In 1955, the total number of corporations in the USA exceeded 660,000. Over 75% of the total amount of the assets of all corporations was concentrated, by means of the holding system, in the hands of 66 milliardaire corporations, i.e., corporations with assets of $1 million and upwards, which disposed directly of 28.3% of the total amount of assets. The finance oligarchy, making use of its effective monopoly position, obtains vast and ever-growing amounts of profit from promotion, i.e., the creation of joint stock companies, from issuing shares and bonds, from floating state loans, and from profitable state orders. Finance capital, concentrated in a few hands, levies an ever-increasing tribute from society. The financial oligarchy rules in the political sphere too. Both the internal and external policies of the bourgeois states are subordinated to the self-interest of the biggest monopolies. Export of capital, characteristic of pre-monopoly capitalism, in which free competition was predominant, was the export of goods. Characteristic of imperialist capitalism, with the domination of monopoly, became the export of capital. The export of capital is undertaken for the purpose of obtaining higher profits. It occurs in two main forms, either by the making of loans to governments, towns, and banks' mother countries, or by the establishing abroad of industrial, commercial, and banking enterprises, obtaining of concessions, building of railway lines, and also the buying up cheap of already existing enterprises in countries weakened, for example, by war. The export of capital is caused, first, by the domination of monopoly in all the countries of developed capitalism and, second, by the monopoly position of a few rich countries in which the accumulation of capital has attained very great dimensions. A vast superabundance of capital came into being in these countries on the threshold of the 20th century. The superabundance of capital in developed capitalist countries is negative in character, for the low standard of living of the masses in these countries sets limits to the further growth of production, and the lagging of agriculture behind industry becomes increasingly marked, together with the unevenness of development of various branches of economy generally. If only capitalism could raise up agriculture and could increase the standard of living of the working masses, then there could be no question of a superabundance of capital. But then capitalism would not be capitalism, for both unevenness of development and a semi-starvation standard of living for the mass of the population are fundamental conditions and prerequisites of this mode of production. The superabundance of capital in capitalistically developed countries is thus only relative. The necessity for exporting capital arises from the fact that in a few countries capitalism has become overripe, and, owing to the backward state of agriculture and the impoverished state of the masses, capital cannot find a field for profitable investment. Lenin, Imperialism, Selected Works, 1950, English edition, Vol I, Point 2, page 495. In its search for maximum profits, surplus capital hastens abroad. Capital is exported predominantly to backward countries, in which there is little capital, wages are low, raw material is cheap, and the price of land is comparatively small. In these countries, monopoly capital is able to obtain and does actually obtain vast profits. The export of capital is closely connected with the growth in the export of commodities. The monopolies which export capital usually press their goods upon the debtor countries on conditions profitable to themselves. Foreign monopolies seize control of markets and sources of new material in debtor countries. Capital is exported not only to backward countries but also to industrially developed ones. This happens during the period of especially rapid development of such countries, which creates a demand for an influx of capital from abroad, e.g. USA before the First World War, or else when they are weakened as a result of war, Germany after the First World War, the Western European capitalist countries after the Second World War. Bourgeois economists and politicians depict the export capital as aid and a boon, allegedly conferred by the developed capitalist countries on backward peoples. In fact, the export of capital, while hastening the development of capitalist relations in backward countries, conduces at the same time to the all-round enslavement and plundering of these countries by alien monopolists. Export of capital provides one of the bases for the system of imperialist oppression, in which a few rich usurer countries exploit the greater part of the world. As a result of the export of capital, the world is divided into a handful of usurer states and a gigantic majority of debtor states. The export of capital has important consequences for the capital exporting countries. These countries, on the one hand, multiply their wealth and strengthen their position on the world market. They receive from abroad a continual flow of surplus value in the form of interest on loans or profits from overseas enterprises. On the other hand, stagnation in the industrial development of the capital exporting countries themselves not infrequently sets in. One of the chief results of the export of capital is a growth of rivalry between the powers, a struggle for the most profitable spheres of investment of capital. Down to the First World War, the principal countries exporting capital were Britain, France, and Germany. Their capital investments abroad amounted to 175 to 200 milliard francs. Britain, 75-100 milliard. France, 60 milliard. Germany, 44 milliard. Export of capital from the USA did not as yet play any great role, amounting to less than 10 milliard francs. After the First World War, very great changes took place in world export of capital. Germany lost her capital invested abroad. The foreign investments of Britain and France were substantially reduced and the export of capital from the USA increased markedly. In 1929, the USA almost drew equal to Britain in the size of its foreign investments. After the Second World War, the export of capital from the USA grew still more. By the end of 1949, American capital investments abroad exceeded the total of overseas capital investments of all the rest of the capitalist states put together. The total amount of American capital invested abroad grew from $2.4 million in 1939 to $39.5 million at the end of 1953. The total amount of British capital investments abroad fell from £3.5 million in 1938 to £2 million in 1951. Economic division of the world between alliances of capitalists. International monopolies as the export of capital grows and as the foreign connections and spheres of influence of the biggest monopolies expand, conditions arise for the division of the world market among them. International monopolies are formed. International monopolies are agreements concluded between the biggest monopolies of various countries on the division of markets, price policy, and the volume of production. The formation of international monopolies means the attainment of a new level of concentration of production and capital, incomparably higher than before. Many international monopolies are formed with the very active participation of capitalist states, and are among the most important methods of economic expansion. Defenders of international monopolies try to present them as instruments of peace, alleging that international agreements between monopolists can settle by peaceful means the contradictions which arise between imperialist groups and countries. Such assertions have nothing in common with reality. In fact, the economic division of the world between international monopolies is carried out in accordance with the strength of the parties, while the strength of the various monopoly groups undergoes changes. Each of them wages an unceasing struggle to enlarge its share and expand its sphere of monopoly exploitation. Changes in the balance of forces inevitably bring in their train intensification of the struggle for redivision of markets, and sharpening of the contradictions between the different groups and the states supporting them. International agreements between monopolists are notorious for their instability, and bear within them the seeds of inevitable conflicts. International monopolies began to arise in the 1860s, 80s. Towards the end of last century, their total number did not amount to more than 40. On the eve of the First World War, there were reckoned to be about 100 international cartels, and before the Second World War their number had risen to more than 300. Even before the First World War, the petroleum market was in practice divided between the American Standard Oil Trust, controlled by Rockefeller, and the Royal Dutch Shell concern, in which British capital wielded preponderant influence. The market for electrical equipment was shared between two monopoly firms, the German General Electric Company, AEG, and the American General Electric Corporation, controlled by the Morgan Group. International monopoly agreements embraced even such fields as the production of armaments. The largest firms engaged in the manufacture of arms, Armstrong-Vickers in Britain, Schneider-Kraussat in France, Krupp in Germany, Bofors in Sweden, were linked together by a multitude of ties over a very long period. International monopolies played a big part in preparing the Second World War. The largest monopolies in the USA, Britain, and France, connected by cartel agreements with the German trusts, inspired and guided the policy of the ruling circles of these countries, a policy of encouraging and instigating Hitlerite aggression which led to war. After the Second World War, a series of international monopolies were formed to guarantee the economic and military interests of American imperialism. This is the function, for instance, of the so-called European Coal and Steel Union, embracing Western Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. Completion of the territorial division of the world among the great powers and the struggle to redivide it, along with the economic division of the world between alliances of capitalists, and in connection with it, there takes place a territorial division of the world among the bourgeois states, a struggle for mastery over foreign lands, a struggle for colonies and semi-colonies. Colonies is the name given to countries which have been deprived of state independence and have become possessions of imperialist metropolitan states. Semi-colonies is the name given to economically underdeveloped countries which are objects of colonial exploitation on the part of imperialist powers and are economically and politically dependent on these states but retain formal independence. Besides colonies and semi-colonies, there exist in the period of imperialism a great variety of types of dependent countries whose degree of dependence varies and is subject to all sorts of changes. Typical of this epoch is not only the two main groups of countries, those owning colonies and colonies, but also the diverse forms of dependent countries which, officially, are politically independent, but in fact are enmeshed in the net of financial and diplomatic dependence. V1. Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Selected Works, 1950, Vol I, Point 2, page 521. Defenders of the bourgeoisie depict imperialist rule over the colonies as a civilizing mission, having the aim of leading backward peoples onto the path of progress and independent development. In reality, imperialism dooms the colonial and dependent countries to economic backwardness, and hundreds of millions of the inhabitants of these countries are doomed to suffer unheard of oppression and slavery, lack of rights and poverty, hunger and ignorance. The seizure of colonies by the imperialist powers leads to unprecedented worsening of national oppression and racial discrimination. In Lenin's phrase, capitalism was transformed in its imperialist phase from the liberator of nations, which it had been in the period of struggle against feudalism, into a monstrous oppressor of nations. As early as the middle of the 18th century, Britain enslaved India, a country of most rich natural resources and with a population which in numbers many times exceeded that of the metropolis. In the middle of the 19th century, the USA seized extensive territories belonging to its neighbor Mexico, and in the following decades established its domination over a number of countries of Latin America. In the 1860s, the colonial possessions of the European countries still occupied a comparatively small part of the overseas territories. In the last quarter of the 19th century, in the period of transition to the monopoly stage of capitalism, the map of the world underwent radical changes. All the developed capitalist countries followed the oldest colonial power, Britain, on the road of territorial conquest. France became a great colonial power towards the end of the 19th century, with possessions amounting to 3.7 million square miles. Germany seized 1 million square miles of territory with 14.7 million inhabitants, Belgium 900,000 square miles with 30 million inhabitants. The USA conquered the most important foothold in the Pacific Ocean, the Philippines, together with Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, and Samoa, besides subjecting de facto a number of countries of South and Central America. Between 1876 and 1914, the so-called Great Powers conquered about 10 million square miles of territory, which was 1.5 times the area of the metropolitan countries themselves. A number of countries were reduced to semi-colonial dependence on the imperialist states. China, with its population amounting to about a quarter of all mankind, and likewise Turkey and Persia, Iran. By the beginning of the First World War, more than half of humanity was under the rule of the colonial powers. The imperialists establish and maintain their power over the colonies by methods of deceit and coercion, utilizing the superiority of their military technique. The history of colonial policy is an unbroken chain of wars of conquest and punitive expeditions against the enslaved peoples, and also of bloody clashes between the countries possessing colonies. Lenin called the War of the United States against Spain in 1898 the first war of the imperialist type, marking the beginning of the epoch of imperialist wars. The revolt of the Filipino people against their conquerors was cruelly put down by the American forces. Towards the beginning of the 20th century, the divisions of the world was complete. The colonial policy of the capitalist countries had led to the conquest of all the lands not hitherto occupied by the imperialists. No more free lands remained. A situation had been created in which every fresh conquest presupposed wresting territory from its owner. The completion of the division of the world placed on the order of the day the struggle to redivide it. The struggle to redivide the already divided world is one of the fundamental distinguishing features of monopoly capitalism. This struggle eventually takes the form of a struggle for world domination, and inevitably leads to imperialist wars on a world scale. Imperialist wars and arms races bring very heavy privations upon the peoples of all the capitalist countries and cost millions of human lives. At the same time, wars and militarization of the economy are profitable matters for the monopolies, bringing them particularly high profits. The basic economic law of monopoly capitalism, as already mentioned, the economic essence of imperialism consists of the replacement of free competition by the dominance of monopoly. The monopolies have as their aim in fixing monopoly prices, as Lenin put it, the obtaining of high monopoly profits, which considerably exceed the average profit. The obtaining of high monopoly profits by the monopolies results from the very nature of imperialism, and is guaranteed by the unprecedented intensification of the exploitation of the working class, by the plundering of the peasantry and other petty commodity producers, by the export of capital to backward countries and the sucking out of all the vital juices from these countries, by colonial conquests and imperialist wars, which are a goldmine for the monopolists. Lenin's works devoted to setting forth the economic and political essence of imperialism contain the initial propositions of the basic economic law of monopoly capitalism. On the basis of Lenin's initial propositions, Stalin formulated the basic economic law of modern capitalism. The main features and requirements of the basic economic law of monopoly capitalism are the following: the securing of the maximum capitalist profit through the exploitation, ruin and impoverishment of the majority of the population of the given country, through the enslavement and systematic robbery of the peoples of other countries, especially backward countries, and lastly, through wars and militarization of the national economy, which are utilized for the obtaining of very high profits. Stalin, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, 1952, FLPH edition, pp. 43-4. Thus, the basic economic law of capitalism, the law of surplus value, is further developed and made concrete in the period of imperialism. In pre-monopoly capitalism, free competition led to a leveling of the rate of profit of the individual capitalists, and the law of the average rate of profit prevailed. In the conditions of imperialism, the monopolies secure for themselves high, monopolistic maximum profits. It is precisely maximum profit that furnishes the driving force of monopoly capitalism. Outflow of capital from one branch to others also occurs in the monopoly stage of capitalism, and the tendency to equalization of profits exists. This tendency clashes, however, with the operation of the basic economic law of monopoly capitalism, the law of maximum capitalist profit. In the epoch of imperialism, commodities produced by monopolized branch of production are sold for the most part at monopoly prices, exceeding the price of production and ensuring high monopoly profits, but commodities produced by non-monopolized branches are often sold at prices below the price of production, so that the entrepreneurs concerned do not receive even the average profit. The objective conditions for the obtaining of maximum profit are created by the establishment of the dominance of the monopolies in the various branches of production. The concentration and centralization of capital attains their highest level in the phase of imperialism. Because of this, the expansion of production calls for vast investments of capital. On the other hand, in the period of monopoly capitalism, a ferocious competitive struggle develops among these giant enterprises. It is the most powerful monopolies, which dispose of the largest capitals and receive the maximum profits, that are victorious in this struggle. By drawing upon the maximum profits, the monopolies are able to secure their supremacy in the capitalist world. The monopoly's pursuit of maximum profits leads to a sharpening of all the contradictions of capitalism. The general basis of the maximum profit of the capitalist monopolies, as of all capitalist profits, is surplus value, extracted from the workers through exploiting them in the process production. The exploitation of the working class is raised the monopolies to its utmost extent. By using all kinds sweating systems of organization and payment of labor, an exhausting intensification of labor is achieved, which signifies above all a tremendous growth in the rate and amount of surplus value extracted from the workers. Further, the intensification of labor leads to many of the workers becoming redundant and falling into the ranks of the unemployed, without hope of returning to industry. Also thrown out of work are all those workers who find the unbearably excessive speeding up of the production processes beyond their strength. In the USA, the rate of surplus value in mining and manufacturing industry, calculated on the basis of official data, was in 1889 145%, in 1919 165%, in 1929 210%, in 1939 220%, and in 1947 about 260%. Thus, over a period of less than 60 years, the rate of surplus value grew by 80%. At the same time, real wages decline as a result of the rise in the cost of living and the growing burden of taxation. In the epoch of imperialism, the gap between the worker's wages and the value of his labor power grows ever wider. This signifies an intenser operation of the general law of capitalist accumulation, which causes the relative and absolute impoverishment of the proletariat. The growth in the exploitation of the working class in the process of production is supplemented by robbery of the working people as consumers. The workers have to overpay large sums to the monopolies, which fix high monopoly prices for the goods they produce and sell. In the conditions of monopoly capitalism, the goods produced by the monopolies are sold not at their prices of production but at substantially higher monopoly prices. A monopoly price is equivalent to the cost of production plus the maximum profit, which considerably exceeds the average profit. A monopoly price is higher than the price of production and, as a rule, exceeds the value of the goods. At the same time, monopoly prices, as Marx already pointed out, cannot abolish the limits set by the value of commodities. The high level of monopoly prices does not alter the total sum of value and surplus value produced in world capitalist economy. One of the sources of the maximum profit received by the monopolies is the redistribution of surplus value, as a result of which the level of profits declines considerably in the non-monopolized enterprises. Maintaining prices at a high level which exceeds the value of the commodities, the monopolies appropriate the results of the growth in the productivity of labor and the reduction in the costs of production. What the monopolies gain, the workers, the petty producers, and the inhabitants of the dependent countries lose. The fiscal policy of the bourgeois states serves as an important instrument of monopoly inflation of prices. In the epoch of free competition, it was predominantly the weaker countries, whose industries needed protection from foreign competition, that resorted to high customs duties. In the epoch of imperialism, on the contrary, high tariffs served the monopolies as a means of attack, of struggle for fresh markets. High tariffs help to keep up monopoly prices within the country. For the purpose of conquering new markets abroad, the monopolies make extensive use of dumping the sale of goods in foreign markets at knockout prices, considerably less than the prices charged in the home market and often even below the cost of production. Expansion of external outlets by means of dumping helps to keep prices high inside the country itself without reducing production, while the losses caused by dumping are covered by charging these enhanced prices on the home market. After the external market in question has been conquered and consolidated by the monopolies, they go over to selling their goods there at high monopoly prices. Exploitation of the bulk of the peasantry by the monopolies is expressed above all in the fact that the domination of the monopolies gives rise to an increasing divergence between the level of prices of agricultural produce and that of industrial products, the so-called price-scissors, while selling their goods at inflated prices. The monopolies at the same time buy tea from the peasants, the produce of their holdings, at extremely reduced prices, monopoly low purchase prices. Monopoly prices, which serve as a means of pumping resources out of agriculture, hold back its development. One of the most powerful instruments for the ruining of the peasant holdings is the development of mortgage credit. The monopolies get the peasants entangled in loans and then acquire their land and chattels for themselves at very low prices. Through mortgages, through the machinations of financial pirates, through high taxes and excise, through high rents, and especially through competition on the part of the large capitalist landowners, the bourgeoisie is ruining the middle and small peasants. M. Torres wrote in his work The Communist Party's Policy in the Countryside. The purchase of the peasants produced by the monopolies at extremely low prices does not mean at all that the urban consumer receives cheap foodstuffs. Between the peasant and the urban consumer stand the middlemen merchants associated together in monopoly organizations which ruin the peasants and fleece the urban consumers. Further, a source of maximum profits for the monopolies is the enslavement and plundering of economically backward and dependent countries by the bourgeoisie of the imperialist states. The systematic robbery of the colonies and other backward countries and the transformation of a number of independent countries into dependent countries constitute an integral feature of monopoly capitalism. Imperialism cannot live and develop without an uninterrupted flow of tribute from the foreign lands which it plunders. The monopolies draw vast revenues above all from their capital investments in the colonial and dependent countries. These revenues are the fruit of the most ruthless and inhuman exploitation of the working masses of the colonial world. The monopolies gain through non-equivalent exchange, i.e., selling their commodities in colonial and dependent countries at prices considerably in excess of their value, and buying the commodities produced in these countries at extremely low prices which do not cover their value. In addition, the monopolies draw from the colonies high profits on the transport, insurance, and banking operations which they carry out. Finally, wars and militarization of the economy are one of the ways whereby the monopolies secure maximum profits. Wars enrich the magnates of finance capital to an enormous extent, and in the intervals between wars, the monopolies try to maintain the high level of their profits through an unrestrained arms drive. Wars and militarization of the economy bring the monopolists fat war contracts, paid for by the treasury at inflated prices, and an abundant flow of loans and subsidies from the resources of the state budget. In wartime, all labor laws are suspended. The workers are proclaimed to be in a state of mobilization and strikes are forbidden. All this enables the capitalists to raise the degree of exploitation through screwing up the intensity of labor. At the same time, the standard of living of the working masses falls as a result of the growth of taxation and the rising cost of living. Thus, the militarization of capitalist economy both in war conditions and in peacetime means a severe intensification of the exploitation of the working masses in the interests of the growth of maximum profits for the monopolies. The basic economic law of modern capitalism, which determines the whole course of development of capitalism in its imperialist phase, enables us to understand and explain the inevitability of the growth and sharpening of the insoluble contradictions inherent in it. Brief conclusions. 1. Imperialism, or monopoly capitalism, is the highest and last stage of development of the capitalist mode of production. The transition from pre-monopoly capitalism to monopoly capitalism took place in the last third of the 19th century. Imperialism finally took shape at the beginning of the 20th century. 2. The basic economic features of imperialism are I. Concentration of production and capital, attaining such a high level of development that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. 2. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital and formation on this basis of finance capital and a financial oligarchy. 3. Export of capital, as distinct from export of goods, assumes particularly great importance. 4. International monopoly alliances are formed among the capitalists to divide the world among themselves. The territorial division of the earth among the largest imperialist powers is completed. The completion of the economic division of the world leads to a struggle to redivide it, and this inevitably gives rise to imperialist wars on a world scale. 3. The basic economic law of monopoly capitalism is the ensuring of the maximum capitalist profit through the exploitation, ruining and impoverishing of the majority of the inhabitants of the country concerned, through enslaving and systematically robbing the peoples of other countries, especially backward countries, and finally, through wars and militarization of the national economy.